So we know that we need some components on our base pawn class. We know that we need a base mesh for the bottom part of the tank and the turret. We also need a turret mesh for the top part. We need a capsule to handle collision, and we need a projectile spawn point. That's going to be a scene component. Now, once we've added these things to the base pawn class, then anything that we create based on this class will inherit those things. So we could create a tank based on base pawn, and then we could go and create a tower also based on base pawn. And because they're based on base pawn, they inherit these components. The tank can have its own base mesh, its own turret mesh, its own capsule, and its own projectile spawn point. And likewise, the tower will get its own base mesh, turret mesh, capsule component, and projectile spawn point as well. And we'll see very soon how we can assign different meshes to each of these so they look different. So we know that we need some components. Now it's time to actually add some components to our base pawn class. Now, by default, we already have a public section, a protected section, and the second public section down here. There are various reasons to have multiple public sections, and we'll talk about those later. But for our components, we're going to create a private section. As you've learned previously, it's good to have member variables be private, so that way they're only accessible from within the class that owns them. So we need some components. The first one I'm going to add is the capsule. So let's create a variable of type uCapsuleComponent. Now this is going to be a pointer. We're going to use pointers for the majority of our variables as long as they're not base types like integer or float. And as you know, that's because pointers are lightweight, they're just addresses, and they allow us to be more efficient. So we have this uCapsuleComponent pointer, and we're going to call this CapsuleComp, short for capsule component. Now, just above capsule component, we're going to add an Unreal Engine specific macro and its uProperty in all caps with its own parentheses. uProperty is a way to make Unreal Engine aware of this variable so that it can participate in Unreal Engine's reflection system. The reflection system allows us to do things like expose this variable to blueprints and participate in garbage collection and things like that. So adding the uProperty is going to be something that will add to our components as we create them. So we have this capsule component, and because we're using the uCapsuleComponent type, we need to let the compiler know about this type. It doesn't know by default what a capsule component is. Now, normally, to tell the compiler what a capsule component is, we would include a header file up here at the top with our include directives. If we go to the Unreal Engine documentation and search for uCapsuleComponent, we can see right here where it says include the header file that we would need to include to tell the compiler about the capsule component. Now, we could include this right here at the top. And then our uCapsuleComponent type would be recognized by the compiler and everything would be hunky-dory. But general good practice when it comes to coding these things is to try to keep this header file as small as possible. Whenever we include a header file in this file, a program called the preprocessor takes all of the contents of that header file, strips out some things like comments, and then literally pastes all of the contents of that header file into this file. The result is that this file gets bigger because it has the contents of that included file pasted in here. We only want to include things when we use them. So how do we get away with not including the header file here in the base pawn header? Well, we can use something in C++ known as forward declaration. We forward declare this uCapsuleComponent type using the class keyword like this. Notice the compiler now shows this type as green. Whenever we forward declare a variable, we're then able to get away with not including its header file. It's telling the compiler that this is a type, so it'll no longer give us IntelliSense errors saying that it doesn't recognize this as a type. Now, this is an incomplete type. If we actually try to use this type, either by accessing members like functions and variables, or trying to construct an object of this type, we would get an error because it's an incomplete type. We would need the header file included wherever we use this type to do those things. So we could forward declare a pointer of a type to avoid needing the header file. But it's important to note that we do need header files to inherit from particular classes. Notice that this class inherits from a pawn, and the pawn.h header file is included here at the top. So inheritance does require the header file for the type we're inheriting from. So let's discuss forward declaration and why we'd want to do it. Let's say we have a class called basePon, which needs to have a pointer variable of type uCapsleComponent. Now, uCapsleComponent is in the capsulecomponent.h header file. Now, we're actually going to use this type in basePon when we construct an object of the uCapsleComponent type. So in basePon.h, all we really need is to have a pointer of type uCapsleComponent. Now, the truth is, basePon.h doesn't actually need the implementation details of the capsule component class. In other words, it doesn't need to know how the functions are defined or even how big the capsule component class is. A capsule component pointer is the same size as any other pointer. It's just an address. Now, in the basePon class, we want to construct the capsule component. For this reason, we need to know the size of a capsule component in order to lay out the memory necessary for creating this object. So while the capsule component header is not strictly needed in basePon.h, it's absolutely needed in basePon.cpp. So good programming practice is to only include headers where you actually need them. So we can get away with declaring a pointer of type uCapsleComponent pointer in basePon.h and then include capsulecomponent.h where we need the implementation details because we're constructing a capsule component and we need to know the size of a uCapsule component in memory. Now let's discuss the consequences of including the header file in basePon.h instead. As we've seen, we can absolutely do this. And you may be thinking, well, we're including it in basePon.cpp anyway, so what difference does it make if we include it in one file versus another? Now here's where the problem comes in. Header files are designed to be included by other files. So let's say that we have basePon.h and we've included capsulecomponent.h in it. And then further down the road, we have some other class. And we're going to have a basePon pointer in some other class, just like we had a capsule component pointer in basePon. Now, rather than going through the trouble of forward declaring the basePon pointer in some other class, we're just going to declare it as normal and include basePon in some other class.h. So now not only does basePon.h include the capsule component header, which results in more code being copied into that header file, now some other class has basePon, which includes capsule component. So all of the content in capsulecomponent.h is also inside of some other class.h, and it's not even needed there. Some other class.h only needs to know about basePon. It doesn't care about capsule component. Now say we continue this pattern and create some other class called yet another class. And yet another class may need to have a pointer of type some other class. Now, rather than forward declaring, we just include some other class.h in yet another class.h, and now inside of yet another class.h, even though we don't even need the header for basePon or capsulecomponent.h, we got it in yet another class because some other class includes those header files inside of it. So we have copies of all of the contents of capsulecomponent.h and basePon.h just stuck here in yet another class, bloating up that file and increasing compile times, all because we didn't forward declare. So instead, the better thing to do is include header files where they're actually needed. So if we take capsulecomponent.h and only include it in basePon.cpp, then later down the road when we create some other class and actually need to use the basePon, we can include the header there. And basePon.h does not include capsulecomponent.h, so all that extra code is not included in some other class. And then when we go and create yet another class, which needs some other class, we can include some other class.h in yet another class.cpp where it's actually needed, and then yet another class.h does not get filled up with the contents of other header files that it doesn't need. So when classes have dependencies like this, basePon depends on capsule component, it's best to keep those dependencies to a minimum. So I'm going to challenge you to create a compilation error. We shouldn't be afraid of compilation errors. They're just a normal part of the development process. So we're going to generate one intentionally. Go back and remove the class keyword and compile without forward declaring capsulecomp.
Now, when I say compile, I mean you can compile from Visual Studio Code, just a regular C++ compile. You've learned how to do that. Or you can simply save your file in Visual Studio Code and initiate live coding. Either one of those is fine, and once we go through this together, I'll show you what happens with both methods. If you use live coding, of course, you're going to be looking at the generated output in the live coding window, as opposed to the output that you would see in Visual Studio Code. Now, spoiler, you're going to get a compilation error. Look at the compilation error message. See what it's telling you. This is just to familiarize ourselves with the errors that we generate. Then, after this, go back and forward declare capsule_comp using the class keyword. Once you've done that, compile again. You should get a successful compilation this time. Pause the video and give this a try. All right, so let's wreak some havoc on our code here. I'm going to remove the class keyword. Okay, so we've attempted to compile, and here is the output in the terminal. The first thing we see is error, and it gives us an error code. And it says capsule_comp is not a member of A base pawn. We have a note that says C declaration of A base pawn. And then we see that we get other errors as a result of this. So oftentimes, students will get confused when they attempt to compile and see multiple errors. So this goes to show that a single mistake can propagate a series of errors, and that doesn't mean you have to go and fix a whole bunch of files. The error could have a single origin. Here we know what the origin of the error is. We need to forward declare. Now, let's see what happens if we use live coding instead of regular compilation in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to go ahead and click the button to initiate live coding, and right away in red I see build failed. And we see the same thing here. Right here, capsule_comp is not a member of A base pawn. Note, see the declaration of A base pawn. So we see the same thing here. So either case, we're going to see an error like this when we forget to forward declare. So now we know what it looks like. And now we're more informed and less afraid of these mysterious compilation error messages. So what we're going to do is fix this error by forward declaring uCapsule_component, and then we can attempt to compile again. And now we've compiled without any errors. So now we see what it looks like when we forgot to forward declare a variable. Keep that in mind when you get compiler errors in the future. So in summary, we discussed forward declaration when creating a new pointer, and we learned that you should only include what you use in the .cpp file, and we should include as little as possible in the .h file. We know that we don't need the header file to declare a new pointer as long as we forward declare, and that we do need the header file if we're going to be constructing an object of a particular type, and we do need the header file to access members like functions and variables. And we saw that we actually do need the header file for inheritance. If we're inheriting from a class, we need that header file there. So now that we know how to forward declare a type and we have our pointer capsule_comp, we're ready to actually construct a capsule component object, and we'll do that in the next video. I'll see you soon.